Hello, folks. I've got a very special guest for you today. If you've ever used Alexa or Watson, his work is part of their DNA. He created a company, Yap, after leading AI and voice processing teams at IBM. He later sold Yap to Amazon and then ultimately formed one of the foundations of Alexa. That alone is extremely interesting and is the type of story that I want to tell on this podcast. But even more exciting is the fact that Igor has launched a new AI company focused on enterprise applications that is getting some major traction and recently had a huge announcement. I've got Igor Jablokov today. Igor, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me, John.
Great. So I want to get into Pryon, your new company, but before we do, can you tell the folks how you came to get into this space and why you started Yap to begin with?
Yeah, great question. So I started my career at IBM as a research engineer in microelectronics. And just halfway through my career, I was just so passionate about speech recognition. Nothing's more thrilling than talking to a machine and seeing it think and come up with answers for you. It just blew my mind. Mm-hmm. Certainly, all of us experienced that. As children and teens, watching Star Trek and so much other sci-fi that had these types of thinking and talking computers. And I was just, so thrilled about it. And after a while, I did everything possible to go into the speech business unit and had a leadership position there where we started working on a lot of the fundamentals that people now take for granted in their kitchens, in their bedrooms, and everywhere you can think of in between.
Very cool. And I think, a lot of people talk about if you do something that you love, it doesn't feel like work. But that's one of the consistent themes that I see with founders that I interview is the ones who are the most successful are the ones who are truly passionate and they're solving problems that are meaningful to them on a personal level.
And here's why, right? I think you have to be patient zero. If you're fundamentally solving a problem for yourself, there's a million other people just like you out there. So for me, I don't even know how to type. I type with two fingers like this. I never got the hang of it like I probably should have, given how important writing is to our everyday lives. But to compose a text message, if you remember those flip phones way back when, you had to press a button 32 times to get a semicolon to appear, when I can just say semicolon.
Yeah.
It just shows up. That's a lot better. You end up being the person that wants knowledge of all types, answer any question in a second. And guess what? There's 100 other million people that wanted the same thing.
Yeah, it's interesting too. You point out that we've all experienced it's the number one way that we interact with one another, obviously. And then there's visual cues as well. But I think talking is a very intuitive interface. But it is funny because we've got, I think 4 or 5 Alexas in the house now, and the kids default to Alexa for everything. And my wife and I we use it a lot, but we still do things on our app or on our computer that we probably could do just as easily on Alexa. But I guess for kids who haven't learned those habits yet, it's a much more natural interface. And I'd be curious your thoughts on, do you think that how long do you think it becomes before we start to see people having much less skills on using the more traditional interfaces that we do use? Do you think about that much, or?
Well, think about it. I think that's a normal progression of innovative technologies. You and I don't know how to use a slide rule. You and I don't know how to process punch cards, right? So as these things move forward, many people don't even know that their PCs and their Macs have command lines and have never seen one, to do anything because they're used to, using graphical user interfaces. So
nobody that I'm friends with, Igor.
Well, I mean,
I'm joking.
I still play around with some of that stuff. Otherwise, I feel like I'll atrophy. But no, I mean, it's normal. If you handed a flip phone to a modern teenager and asked them to compose or reply to a text message on it, they wouldn't even know how to do that on a Razor.
Yeah,
right? So,
very good point.
It's normal, and yet, the brilliance of Apple and all of these other folks developing these newfangled UIs is the fact that now infants, right, 2-year-olds can stare at a screen and they touch it, and Sesame Street, pops up on there. and
Yeah.
they just intuitively get how to access and make these characters move from the left side of the screen to the right.
Well, so I have my 7-year-old has grown up almost exclusively on streaming content, and we do have the Sling service, which it is a streaming content, but it's also programming. And there was one show that he found somehow on Cartoon Network that wasn't available on the streaming networks yet, and he found it, he watched it, and then he said, like, a couple hours later, Dad, I want to watch another episode of whatever, the Paw Patrol or whatever it was. And I said, oh, it's not on right now. And he looked at me like, Dad, what's wrong with you? What do you mean on? It's just,
Right.
It's just not, it's just a very unnatural thing. And it's funny to see how these things change and subsequent generations adopt things a whole lot faster.
You're exactly right. They will not have any patience for linear programming of any type, where something precisely starts at a certain time, ends at a certain time. It really, conforms to their own lifestyles.
Well, along those lines, have you seen any stats? And I should know this given some of my background too, but have you seen any stats on Alexa skills versus apps? Like, do you think it's 70% of apps have Alexa skills, companion Alexa skills developed, or do you think it's more like 20 or 10 or?
Far less than that. I mean,
okay.
If you look at the typical App Store or the Google Play Store, I mean, the number of apps that they have are measured in the absolute millions, right? It's just a more mature platform, and it's a visual interface where a lot of people will understand that. Voice user interfaces are still abstractions and hidden away, and I think they're going to have to move to an appless experience where just get me an Uber ride to the airport. You don't want to have to install and configure a skill in order to do that. It should natively know how to do that for you by default.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So maybe we could talk to how AI and voice interactions have changed through the years, and why maybe Amazon has been able to pull off in home AI, what would have been really hard to do 10 years ago, certainly, but probably even 5 years ago. Can you just maybe talk about kind of the converging factors that have driven such rapid change in that space?
That's interesting. A lot of these breakthroughs people think are so modern and recent. I'm gonna let your listeners in on something. The original concept of the Amazon Echo, which you now hear chirping behind. I got to be careful.
Right on cue.
right on cue. In 2003, I approached the IBM team, and I said, "Hey, we're doing this joint project with Toshiba and Sony and ourselves, and it's known as the PlayStation. Let's put a microphone on it, because they're going to be everywhere in everybody's living room, and people can then talk to it in order to access content and things of that sort." And they literally practically fell on the floor laughing, saying, "Oh my gosh, that's so silly. Nobody's ever going to put a microphone in their house. You're crazy. Get out of here." And, I remember saying that to, I think, a Popular Science article. They asked, well, what's one of the innovations that's coming for AI and voice interfaces and what have you? And I'm like, listen, you're going to be able to talk to your television one day and ask anything you want, and it's going to appear a second later. And I was steamed, because that quote they put in an article labeled America in 2025. That's how far out in sci-fi they thought these innovations were, when we already had prototypes of these things in our labs. Now, it took a decade until people could consume the Fire TV that had those capabilities blended in them. A year later, also at IBM, we went to them and said, "Hey, right now, our clients that are banks and airlines and these types of major enterprises, they don't know how to consume artificial intelligence and speech recognition technologies. They have to install, 100 plus CDs, multiple servers. They don't have the in-house capabilities to do that. Let's go ahead and host all of these in a centralized location. They'll send us the audio file, and we'll send back the transcription." What do? They fell on the floor laughing again. They're like, oh my gosh, your sensitive customer transactions, nobody will allow sensitive customer transactions to leave their firewalls and their data centers. You're crazy.
Yeah.
Then the following year, we said, oh my gosh, if we host it, and by the way, when I say the word hosted, I'm putting that in air quotes because that's cloud. What I'm talking about is creating an AI cloud. When we have this centralized location, people not only can send us audio files, we can give them answers back, not just the transcriptions. And by then they lost it. I mean, I think they were, gasping for air. It just seemed far-fetched. They said the processing power wasn't there, the networking wasn't there, the memory wasn't there. All of these conditions weren't there, but these are things that, a lot of us had an inkling were coming.
Sure. I mean, Moore's law was well underway by that point, and networking was growing very fast. I don't know if I would have foreseen bandwidth, all of that exploding and dropping in price as quickly as it did, and certainly the phones at the time didn't have nearly the capacity that they do now. But I think you could see that the trends were coming, and probably before 2025 they'd be available. And that was right around the time that Amazon actually announced AWS. Is that correct, or started AWS as a commercial offering?
No, I think they started it. I don't know the exact year.
Was this 06 type of time frame? Because I think it was 06 that they officially offered it to the public.
Well, hold on, let's ask Echo. When did AWS start? Okay, they don't know how to answer.
So I couldn't hear it. It didn't get picked up by the microphone, but Echo wasn't sure.
Right. So it didn't start yet. It started after we started our last company. Because we were, I think, the first AI cloud company ever.
Okay.
That ever existed, and the customers that IBM didn't think would move to cloud, which were some of the most robust and exacting environments, service providers, also known as carriers, wireless carriers, so AT&Ts, Verizons, and everything else. Sprint was a customer. They all started moving their transactions over to our platform. Microsoft was a customer. And so that's, in some ways, this is why IBM missed the cloud. There were a lot of us that were saying this was coming, and we had early mover advantage and certainly the technical capabilities and the talent to service that. But nobody believed that corporate America was going to be consuming computing resources in this new way.
So why do you think Amazon was able to get there when IBM wasn't? And I guess that's a broader question. That's probably the same reason they got to public cloud in a way that IBM never did. They got to the AI. They've gotten to all sorts of things before a lot of other legacy vendors, but that's got to be astounding to you coming from an IBM to see that the three biggest cloud providers are Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, and not Oracle or IBM or SAP or some of these other large vendors who had a lot of reasons why they could have owned that cloud if they wanted to.
Well, I mean, like my chief operating officer, Jeff Frazier, says, if you do the right thing too long, you're in trouble.
Okay.
Right. So they had a recipe that worked for them that certainly turned them into a very prominent company, but you can't do that too long.
Yeah.
Amazon was willing to experiment. Maybe one of their product managers showed up and said, hey, we have all this excess processing capacity that only is really used around the holidays. Let's resell it. And somebody said, okay, let's give it a shot and see what happens. At IBM, I had to stand in front of the investment review board, and I practically had to justify a course of action whether or not it could deliver $100 million in revenue within 12 months. And I can assure you, even in my last company, guess what? We weren't able to return $100 million in revenue within 1 year. But guess what? Within one technical generation, we can all guess that Amazon is making well over $1 billion on this a year now.
Absolutely. And I've seen some estimates that are even higher than that, depending on who the analyst is. It's interesting because Microsoft could have fallen victim to the same things, and for many years did, right? They missed social, they missed mobile, they missed all these trends. And it really took somebody coming in who said, you know what, we're no longer protecting the monopoly. That's not the prime directive. We're 40 years into this company. and we're going to go out there and we're going to battle and scrap for the cloud. And it's a bold move because you risk cannibalizing your office business, you risk cannibalizing your Windows operating system business. But it's the same thing that Steve Jobs said, hey, I don't mind if we cannibalize our Mac business. Somebody's going to do it with a tablet if we don't do it. And so I admire that when a big company like a Microsoft can make those mistakes for many years, arguably decades, and then come in and you can have one person come in and just change that culture and mindset. It's really impressive to see that.
Yeah, he's doing a great job. And here's the thing, by being willing to give up office, people are going to office in droves, right?
That's true.
Google on productivity 10-1, right? For the first time, Teams is surpassing Slack in some cases, right?
Yep.
They're hopefully figuring out the fusion of Skype and Yammer and Teams and some of the legacy experiences that they had, like GroupMe and what have you. It's all a work in progress in some ways. This is what's thrilling about being in this industry is we all have lifetime employment. There's going to be never-ending innovations and bugs to fix and things to adapt and grow, which is why turn of the century, it's so comical that the head of the patent office thought everything that could be invented has been. Right? If you think about what our daily lives are today relative to even 5 years ago, it's bonkers, and we can't even imagine what's coming next.
Oh, it's crazy, the rate of change. So I'm curious, when you started Yap, maybe can you speak to what you thought the killer application would be for Yap, and then maybe how that evolved over time?
Yeah, what's interesting is the killer app literally was meant to be an AI assistant that you ask any question and a second later you get an answer back.
Okay.
We tried taking that to the market. It was too big of an idea and people didn't get it. They're like, why would I do that? Why wouldn't I just open up my laptop and type something into Google or load Amazon and purchase something? Why would I speak to this thing in order to run these transactions? And so we ended up focusing just on messaging, right? Because we noticed a lot of teenagers were texting while driving, and
a lot of adults,
a lot of adults as well. And we thought, you know what? On these little silly flip phones, if we put our Yap application on them, when you received a text message, you can just speak a reply, and again, instead of pressing 32 buttons 32 times in order to get a semicolon, and it's a lot safer for folks. Well, the problem back then was there were no smartphones. You had to be certified on every carrier that you delivered the application. It was
yeah, there was no Twilio, right? Not that you would have used a Twilio today for that type of thing, but there was nobody that really kind of built those abstractions, right? So you were very carrier dependent, I suppose.
Right. So we had to directly integrate with the carriers. More importantly, we had to create applets. Each app was individually programmed for every phone type because every phone type captured audio a different way. And then you had to get it certified for the carrier.
And when you say an applet, were these written in C or did some of them have like a Java mid-P profile so you could at least use a JVM? Or
yeah, for Verizon, there was a programming language called Brew.
I remember Brew. Yeah. Wow.
And there was J2ME for...
yeah, that was the mid-P, because I remember J2ME had 6 or 7 profiles, because originally they thought, we'll program cable boxes or Xboxes or other things. And I think mid-P was the one for like...
Oh, that stuff was a hot mess. I mean...
Yeah, it was.
Not all of them gave you access to the APIs that you needed in order to do that. And so you know what ended up doing? Because there were no app stores and this really flaky, fragmented support, we pulled back and just became a speech cloud.
Okay.
So then we started processing people's voicemails, their messages. We started mining phone calls, and we built a terrific business based on that. Like I said, Metro PCS and Sprint, Microsoft. We had dozens of enterprise and carrier customers. Behind the scenes, though, we always had a Skunksworks working on the AI assistant, always. Okay. And so the new company's name, Pryon, Pryon, was the code name that we gave to our own engines.
Okay.
And so that's the engine that became the nucleus for what people now know as Alexa.
And is a Pryon some sort of fundamental particle, or I should know the origin of that, but what does that actually come from? I get that it was the code name, but what drove that being the code name?
So it's a misspelling of a prion, Prion, which is the protein that causes mad cow disease.
Okay, naturally.
So the reason why our scientists named it after that protein, it's sort of like a convoluted in-joke for machine learning and supervised learning, which is that the computer is learning from its own output, meaning it's reading its own output and figuring out ways to improve it. The way that mad cow disease is triggered, it's cows ingesting bits of dead cows, unfortunately.
Gotcha. Well, that's very clever.
Clever, dark humor, and doesn't lend itself to explanation.
Yeah. Well, you could just lie and say it's a fundamental particle, gluon, muon, prion. Nobody would know.
That's right.
So back to the killer app. So I see the evolution for you there. What do you think is the killer app right now? Or are we still looking for the killer app? Not necessarily on enterprise, because I want to talk about that when we get to Pryon, but within even consumer and AI. I mean, as I mentioned, my kids interact with their echoes probably 30, 40 times a day. So clearly there are good apps, but do we have a killer app yet? And what do you see for the future of that?
Well, I mean, that's why Amazon was shrewd. They noticed that people were really enjoying listening to music off these smart speakers, and you know, to your earlier point about some of you know, Satya's decisions and leadership, that there are no sacred cows. Even though Amazon wanted to drive their own music services, they still shrewdly allowed the Echo to work with Spotify and other competitive services, because they knew that a lot of people were getting attracted to their platform to listen to music.
Well, and in a sign of the times, Apple recently launched an Alexa skill, if I'm not mistaken, for iTunes, right? Did I read that correctly? Or
that's right. So Apple Music is now supported on that platform as well. So if you're really smart, what you do is you focus on getting yourself into as many platforms as possible. And listen, it just, you know, puts the onus on the parallel team that's working on the hardware just to work, you know, more aggressively to make it the first choice for consuming your services. Otherwise, you know, just get on as many platforms as possible. By the way, this is why in the recent Apple earnings, they did better than expected. Is why? Because they're starting to open up their APIs to AirPlay and other capabilities to other TV vendors.
Sure.
Right? Cannibalizing their own Apple TV, which is a very shrewd bet, because why would, if you were an OEM, why would you not add, you know, native Apple support?
That's interesting. So you think the ecosystem is the killer app, which really was for the iPhone. Opening up the App Store was what really changed the game. I mean, they'd made a lot of good decisions, but I think you could probably point to that as one of the shrewdest things that Apple did, was opening up an ecosystem to developers.
Yeah, and Steve Jobs resisted that. So that's another piece of trivia that most people don't get is there was a good bit of the iPod engineering team that was based in North Carolina. Well, they ended up crossing paths with us early on when we first started the last company. By 2007, we were designed into a prototype iPhone that never saw the light of day. That's how early Apple was thinking about putting AI onto their platforms. This is before they acquired Siri.
I had heard a version of that story. I didn't know the whole thing. What I had heard, and obviously there's a lot of mythology about Yap because it's arguably the biggest or most important or first major exit in the tech space for Charlotte. So there's a lot of stories out there, and it was so secretive when everything went down. But what I had heard was that at one point, they might have even had a version of Yap installed on the iPhone at the same time for a demo, but it must be the story that you just told, and it just somehow got morphed into that.
That's exactly it. So we had to sign a super tight NDA. We handed stuff, practically in like a black bag. I have no idea where it went. I had no idea what it was used for. but it became obvious that it was for a prototype iPhone. At the time, I think they had two competing designs. They had one based on the iPod OS and one based on the Mac OS. But again, credit to them. They're doing the right thing. They're experimenting. Yeah. They're being aware of where innovation is happening. And
it's keeping optionality, right? They've got the option to go one way or the other, and you keep those options open for as long as you can.
A lot of the things that we typically see that get announced by anybody, it doesn't matter if it's Apple or Samsung or Huawei or this or that, these things are at least half a decade in the making.
Wow. So back to Yap before we start to change gears a little bit here. Can you talk about the money raise? So obviously you're at IBM, you're frustrated, nobody's listening. At some point you make the decision that, hey, I think I'm going to be better off commercializing this on my own. Can you just give a little bit of the high level history of how that all played out and how you raise money over time?
Yeah, great question. So dumb luck or providence, when I was still at IBM, I was getting interviewed a lot. Right. And so back then there was no LinkedIn that was in its heyday where we can publish our resumes so people knew what you were about and what you had experience in. But because I chaired an industry body and there was all of this, external support for the fact that we were leading this next gen of interaction, that was there for people to Google. They just type in your first name, last name, IBM, and they would see that your work was featured on CNN or some other places. So that certainly helped increase the confidence of the angel and seed investors that we crossed paths with at that time. One of the biggest breakthroughs was when we met and eventually invited as our chairman. This was Tim Biltz. Who's now CEO of a carrier. And what was interesting about him is that he came out of the SpectraSite American Tower merger. And what IBM didn't know at the time when they were laughing off that things were going to go to cloud, that he knew was all the fiber optic connections being being deployed by these carriers between their towers. So he knew that data bandwidth was about to skyrocket. And that was the missing piece of the puzzle. And so when he crossed paths with us, he became one of our largest early shareholders and was a terrific mentor to us and became our chairman. And that just turned into a Series A after I think we were the first Southeast company that presented at the first ever TechCrunch conference in San Francisco. And sure enough, in her hands, on a Razr flip phone, we presented the baby version of Alexa. And guess what? People were scratching their heads, not sure what this was all about. And that's where I credit Apple a lot, with Siri, and I credit Google a lot with Google Voice back then, and certainly Amazon since then. They de-risked these things that those of us that run startups, we hit our heads against concrete walls to try to get people to understand what these capabilities are. What do? They throw a Super Bowl ad here and there, and suddenly everybody knows, oh, that's what an AI is.
Yeah, and they throw build massive booths at CES, and they do a very good job of capturing people's imagination on these things and making them safe. So what you mentioned the Series A, what was the order of magnitude of size of that? Were Series A different back then than what you would raise today?
Yeah, it's basically the same dilution, but back then I think we raised a $6.5 million Series A. So all told, from beginning to end, that company raised $12 million.
Wow.
So different time. I mean, AI engineers and scientists were not in demand at all because nobody was working on that.
They weren't making more than starting MLB pitchers back then?
No, it was a different time because, again, this was before the heyday of cloud and the fact that everybody suddenly woke up, even in traditional industries. Oh my gosh, we need an AI story. we're going to be left, in the dust until we figure this out. Oh my God, this is important for national competitiveness with other nation states.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's like everybody's running in all directions scared. And I think we're about to enter the disillusionment, because most of these implementations are going to fizzle out, and because people didn't know how to properly leverage these technologies.
Well, so I was going to save this question for later, because I have a couple more things about the Yap journey that I want to cover, but I think you just hit on something that I do. We'll bring it up now since you just brought it up. Mm-hmm. When we hear the term AI, some people immediately go to a dark place and assume the worst. And I personally think part of the problem is that people confuse AGI with kind of purpose-built AIs, which feels like we're a little closer to the latter and not the former, but you may have a different perspective. Can you comment on what people maybe get wrong when they talk about job losses and the negative impacts of AI?
Yeah, I don't know about job losses. I mean, I probably would give you the same answer that anybody reasonable would give, which is you and I both have jobs that didn't exist a generation ago.
Yeah.
And so somebody would say, hey, we're supposed to be farmers. We're supposed to be coal miners. We're supposed to be this. We're supposed to be that. We're supposed to be, stonemasons. We don't need that anymore. We don't need as many in those different trades. Oh my God, John and Igor are going to be out of work.
Yeah.
Yet we end up having new trades and new skills. And so I honestly think when people go out and scarecrow, oh my God, massive job losses are coming. Well, guess what? You're going to have to take your own career into your own bare hands and retrain yourself and adapt over time.
Yeah.
Maybe that pace of change is happening faster. It's happening within your lifetime, whereas in the past, you had a generation to respond to some of these changes. But the jobs people are going to have 5, 10, 20, 100 years from now are going to be nothing you and I can predict.
Well, how many social media managers were there 10 years ago? Right?
Zero.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's a mess of other types of jobs as well. So there's a really high degree of arrogance when politicians and other folks think that they can predict that we're going to turn into this Mad Max style dystopia where all of us are going to be out of work. It's like, no, humans are resilient and they adapt, and some people do get left behind, but more people benefit from these things. Just like, Bill Gates talks about some of his favorite books, talking about how this is literally the best of times. Mm-hmm. The lowest infant mortality, the highest access to clean water.
Oh yeah, have you read Steven Pinker's work on this? It's astonishing. The data do not bear any resemblance to the 24-hour news cycle.
I know. That's that part's a little bit kooky, but it's normal, right? Because there's politicians that live and die where every 2 to 4 years they scarecrow us that, oh my gosh, this is happening. Oh my gosh, that's happening, because they're trying to get you to press a button, option A or option B.
Very interesting.
I like option C. Take control of your own life.
Yeah. Yes, that is very good advice from in a lot of different contexts as well. So I want to go back to Yap, and you talked about raising money, and I've heard you give some really fascinating talks about where you talk a lot about nonlinearity in a startup journey. And can you maybe speak to that and talk to how that kind of informed the journey with Yap, and maybe even give a little preview of, are you seeing the same thing with Pryon, or you're obviously in a very different place starting Pryon than you were starting Yap, so maybe it's not as pronounced as it was during the Yap days.
I think all founders have a true north, and I'm not trying to put founders on a pedestal. One of my great friends, Stephen Welch, who co-founded Dream It Ventures, wrote a book called "We're All Born Entrepreneurs." I believe you can be entrepreneurial in any endeavor. You can be an entrepreneurial coal miner, entrepreneurial farmer. You can be an entrepreneurial school teacher. You can be an entrepreneurial police detective and fireman, and everything in between. All right. It's a mode of thinking that says, I'm going to be proactive and solve problems.
Or an entrepreneurial nonprofit, right? Yeah.
All of these things. And I think people that have an entrepreneurial mindset have a true north that says, I'm starting at point A and I'm going to get to point B. and I have no idea what happens between point A and point B. I know I need talent. I know I need funding. I know I need certain conditions to happen. I need partners. I need customers. I need clients. I need allies.
Some dumb luck too, right?
Yeah, I need some dumb luck. I need a regulatory environment that's inviting, for investors or contributors. And if I put all of these, pieces together on the chessboard, I can achieve that outcome that I believe the world wants, and would be beneficial to them and also benefit the stakeholders that are around me. I mean, it's really that simple. I mean, we wake up with these, fascinating ideas for, I want to build an electric car. I want to build a rocket ship. I want to build an AI. I want to build this. I want to build that. And the rest, over the course of the next half decade to a decade is just figuring out how to do that just by chiseling at it. It's geologic time, just a little bit a day, a little bit a day, a little bit a day, inch by inch by inch by inch. And the people that aren't meant to unlock that, you know what they do? They blink. You can't blink. It's like when I was with Will.i.am at the Charlotte DNC, right? Mm-hmm. He's like, yeah, everybody's running up to me for autograph, this and that. Where was everybody for the 10 years when I was in smoky, no-name places playing, being a starving artist for all intents and purposes? Everybody thinks you're an overnight success, and yet the one common theme with everybody, and again, nobody's being put on a pedestal. Everybody who unlocks their career aspirations has spent time in the mailroom. Everybody has.
Yep.
Only the silver spooners are the ones that short circuit that. But you know what? I go to some of these country clubs. I see some of those people. I wouldn't trade my life for any one of theirs. There's so much substance that comes from that gritty experience.
Yeah.
It just becomes a fabric of your DNA. If somebody said, hey, I have an easy way to do it. And this is, by the way, something that I tell new recruits. I'm like, listen, you're a hot shot in the field and you're about to get an offer dropped by Google, and you're going to get an offer dropped from us. Let me tell you what you're going to read in the Google offer. It's going to be green fields with rainbows and unicorns frolicking by a little beachside area. And there's going to be a little bushes of candy and stuff like that waiting for you. And it's going to be fantastic. That's going to be their job offer. Mine is going to look like a wicked forest. There's going to be cobwebs. It's going to be cold. It's going to be danked and dreary, and there's going to be creaky, scary noises, and you're going to hear an owl hooting and stuff like that. But I want you to answer this question. Whenever you hear about the big outcomes in history, right, of any type, when people unlock innovations, people unlock massive rewards and things like that, was it going down the unicorn path, the friendly, obvious path? Or was it always going through some challenge, including, all of our, families that immigrated here when there was nothing, people that survived, famines and wars and this and that in order to make it to the other side. All of us who went through our educations, right? People, single moms that launched their children still.
Yep. Yeah, there's something to be said for a bit of adversity. It really does. It does tend to foster some really innovative thinking, and I think that's the dilemma for a lot of really successful people, because nobody wants to. They want to remove every trace of adversity for their children for very good reason, but they kind of understand that it's going to make it much harder for the kid to be as successful as their parents if they don't face those kinds of challenges.
Well, I mean, tongue in cheek. I mean, if they're meant to go into a Google nap pod, so be it. We actually enjoy working because it's not work to us.
Yeah.
Like you started our conversation. I mean, people that are passionate about what they do, view this as their hobbies. If somebody asks me, what is your hobby? I'd be like, this is my hobby. This is why I can do it for 5, 10, 15, 20 hours a day. And it doesn't feel like anything. It's water off a duck's back. It's just a thing that I particularly enjoy. I know it may bore a lot of people to tears, just like I remember being on a flight to Europe once, to London in my youth, and there was this fellow seated next to me. I was working on my laptop. This was when I was still at IBM, and he looked at me and said, "Are you going to be working all night? You know, the lights on." I'm like, I'm sorry. Am I distracting you or disturbing you? I'm like, I'll just shut this down. And so we got to chatting, and I'm like, who are you? Good sir. And I was, a young guy, brash and stuff like that. Probably didn't, understand that I should bite my tongue at times. And he said, "Well, I'm CEO of an insurance company." And without missing a beat, I said, "That sounds boring." Which is, totally, disingenuous say and a really snarky thing to say. And I caught myself. I'm like, oh gosh, that was an impolite thing to say. And he just chuckled and laughed. And he's like, "You know what? Let me tell you why I love it. Without me, people wouldn't build rocket ships and cars and motorcycles and buildings and power plants and this and that. Without us, humanity wouldn't be striving and pushing forth the innovative boundaries that we are, because many of these entities wouldn't take these risks." And that's what I do,
Got it.
for the economies where we operate. He was glowing when he was describing it. I'm not doing his answer justice.
Sure.
The minute that he said that, I got goosebumps.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I will never look at that industry the same way. Right. And
Yeah.
those are frankly the people that we enjoy working. Right. So I don't run an airline. I don't run a bank. I don't run a transportation company. I don't run a retailer or grocery store or anything else. But the people we adore working with as clients, partners, and everything else are the people that are passionate in their respective world. They know their place, and they know how to do it top, and they literally think and dream,
Sure.
their industry, and they're a joy to be around. And it just makes it easier for you to do your thing as well. And when those two things intersect, you can be at top of your game, they're at top of their game, and you get the best outcomes.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. So, I mentioned that I've seen you give a couple talks, and you talked about the nonlinearity. I also know that you've done a lot of advisory work, both formally and informally, if I recall correctly. Can you speak to the difference between advice you give to a first-time startup founder versus maybe how you pursued starting, funding, and scaling Pryon? It's obviously different for someone who's had success and a successful exit to a major name like Amazon, in a high-profile product like Alexa. Can you maybe talk about how different that process is versus the normal advice that you would give somebody starting a company?
Sure, but don't give serial entrepreneurs too much credit. Scott Moody, who's a great friend.
He's the Touch ID, right?
That's right. He's sold his company to Apple, right?
Now K4 Connect.
That's right. He's in K4 Connect out of Raleigh. And one of the things that he shared about his experience that I took to heart starting this company is the only difference between a first-time founder and a serial founder is at least we get doors to open, at a grander scale than even I could in the past, right? But that doesn't guarantee funding. Mm-hmm. Right? Just because the door's open, the idea still has to, be a solid business on its own.
Absolutely.
People just aren't going to say, "Oh, I found, funded you because, here's your track record, and the past is a predictor of the future." There's a tiny tinge of it, but they still have to get it through the rest of their partners. And it's going to have to be an independent idea, because guess what? If a first-time founder is in that same room with you and you're competing for those limited resources, and they have a better business case, a better technology, a better team, a better everything,
more passion,
they deserve to win.
Yeah.
Right. So who cares what your resume says? So there's a little distinction between a new person and somebody with a track record. Now, of course, most of us that are serial entrepreneurs, guess what? We get that. We just work like crazy anyway. It's our normal standard thing. Is we're meritocracy based, right? Mm-hmm. We want to be in environments where we're students, as you said before, sure, we can advise people and we can be mentors to other people, but we want people to advise us, and we want to be the student and the apprentice, right? Because we're going to be in a constant state of change ourselves. So
well said. Yeah.
With first timers, there's certainly a lot more resources than even you and I had, launching our businesses in years past, right? Because there's a lot more, a lot more of these accelerators and incubators out there. There's a lot more books that have been written on this topic. A lot of best practices on the web. There's these MOOCs, right? There was no video training, for startup one-on-one. We had to kind of figure this out, on ourselves, for the relatively few people in our markets that we could ask for advice and have done it before. So there's, we didn't have cloud. We literally had to buy servers, physical servers, and put them into data centers.
Yeah. And then you had to license Oracle software. And
we had to install our own firewalls, physical boxes to secure these things. We had to, there were no WeWorks where we just showed up, get a little pass card, and we got their Wi-Fi thing. We had to install our own Wi-Fi. We had to get our own network drops in our offices, right? We had to get furniture delivered. Nobody was making us coffee, for gosh sakes.
We didn't have standing desks. How did we live?
That's right. So all of these things, we had to do by hand. But of course, I think the expectations are higher for this next generation, because it's like, okay, a whole bunch of things that were previously challenging are easy. So now, our expectation isn't that you're going to have this type of exit. It's this type of exit, because, it's the basics are already handled for you.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess where I was going though is when I saw your pitch, when you were just launching Pryon, or maybe you'd already launched it, but you were just starting to get serious about raising money. You knew what you wanted to do. You had a vision and a passion that was just very obvious to me the minute I saw it. But you're raising, I think you raised $4.5 million, if I recall correct, or somewhere on that order of magnitude, but didn't have a product and didn't really have a team yet, and really just had a pitch with some great ideas and could kind of point to your resume. That's obviously very different than what a first time. And it's not to say that it's necessarily easier for you, but it's just a different mindset. And I think this ties in with, I hear a lot of people complaining about it's so hard to get funding and in Charlotte, especially, or any second tier city, Raleigh, you name it, right? People complain about raising money, and it's like, well, you got to make some progress, or you better have a track record. And I think if you have either of those, you can raise the money, but it's just, I think it is a lot different things that you have to answer if you've never done it before.
Well, last time we didn't get a penny until we had a prototype.
Yeah,
we did it. So we had to prove why, because we had no track record. So we had to do it the way that we tell other people they have to do it. This time I wasn't raising 4.5. I was raising 2 or less. It just became this thing where, I mean, that, it just, more kept coming and more kept coming and more kept coming. And then eventually we just had to.
Well, you didn't come to me asking for money, but I called you afterwards and I was like, hey man, like, can I just put some money into this, please?
And listen, for the right people that you end up funding, I can tell you, I like taking pictures of that Atlas sculpture in front of Rockefeller Center, because that's how I feel. I ask, our financial people, how many stakeholders do we have? How many employees? How many family members are we supporting? How many investors do we have? What are all the number of LPs that they have? I want to feel the weight of all of these people that trusted us with their scarce resources to unlock these capabilities. I've turned down investors. A lot of people typically think that startups are so desperate for cash, they're like going in all directions. No, I want people that match our culture, our temperament, our sensibilities. Odd nation states out there that are being challenged. We wanted to keep them at bay, right? No, I mean, let me be blatant about it. Blood money that comes from different markets, I'm like, yeah, I can live without that. There's no reason for me to make you more money so that you can do.
Well, there have been some pretty well-known Charlotte companies that have raised a lot of money, who have had in the early days, and I might not use the term blood money, but where it's been money that they later regretted raising, and they have to raise money later on down the road to buy out that money so that they can get to the outcome that they otherwise would have a much clearer path to. So it is very important, I think, to be selective with who you take money from, and if they're the right fit. That's a really good point.
And here's the thing: being selective. Okay, guess what? You didn't get instant gratification, but maybe it'll come tomorrow, or the day after, or the week after, or the month after. I'd rather do it right. Where, look, our seed round, was a rolling close for what, practically, 12 to 18 months, but that's doing it the right way instead of just blinking and starting to compromise in certain ways just for speed, which is strange for me to say, because certain things will go faster than people expect. And then there's other things will go slower than people expect as well. It really is, an intuition-based business.
Yep.
Kind of know, right? Sometimes you're in a race car. Okay, we're going to stomp down the accelerator. Now the weather's a little weird, and I don't have good feel for the machine. I'm going to slow it down a little bit because I'm getting some warning lights.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I could talk for days about Yap and your startup journey and the exit to Amazon. This stuff's just fascinating. But I think
so. Amazon wasn't the only one, right? So Google came calling, and Microsoft, and New.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
And a mess of other folks came calling as well. Even though my staff was going to make more at Google, they decided to go to Amazon because it offered them a blank slate, literally blank canvas.
That's cool.
And that's, something a lot of people miss. They typically think, hey, you guys are, always going to maximize, exit values and things like that. I personally didn't want to even sell the company. It was just, a condition of our board and our investors at that point in time where they wanted to take money off the table. Because during, the 2008 downturn, most people forgot that a lot of that crop of startups ended up failing. Right? And so anytime you had a win, people wanted to harvest the win. And we gave our team choices. It's like, hey, you want to go to Google, you want to go to Amazon, you want to go to some of these other players. And they just felt that blank canvas where they could go in and prove to the world what their fingerprints can do and their bare hands could do was a thrill to them. And now they're part of history.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think as interesting as all of that is, I think that what you're building now is even more interesting, if possible, and useful for my audience to kind of hear what you're doing now. First, can you just give the high level pitch for what Pryon is?
Yeah, so we want to take that same experience you have at home and bring it to work. I mean, that's at least the idea in a nutshell. Now, that sounds easy, but at work we have highly regulated environments. More.
Well, there's a hierarchy, right? It's not.
Security requirements. Yeah. You need highly accurate answers to come back because you're going to be making very serious decisions with the information that you're getting. You need it to be very fast. Most businesses aren't like us at home. What happens to most households? You end up picking an ecosystem. I'm going to be in the Google ecosystem with Android and Nest. I'm going to be in the Apple ecosystem with HomePod and Siri and things like that. I'm going to be in the Amazon one, with Ring and some of the other Eero and some of the other brands that they've acquired as well. People tend to pick a homogeneous cluster of providers, right? Some may choose Samsung. Well, at work, what some of these major businesses are like? They grew up through mergers and acquisitions, right? All sorts of combinations, and they find themselves to be heterogeneous environments. They got a little bit of IBM, a little bit of Salesforce, a little bit of SAP, a little bit of Oracle, a little bit of Microsoft, a little bit of Google, Amazon, and a myriad of other vendors in there. So how do you make that Babel mess work together, right? So how do you put all of that together under one interface, and we want to put it under a natural language interface. I think the concept, if you remember that film Matrix, the concept of CRM and the way that Salesforce and other people sell it, I think is obsolete. And here's why. If I asked you to name your most important sales prospect in the next week, that name immediately popped in your head. If I asked you if you had a non-disclosure agreement signed with Acme Corp, that answer popped in your head. If I asked you, who's your point of contact for, the most interesting company that you met in the last 24 hours, that name immediately popped in your head. Benioff isn't selling a license to Salesforce inside of your head. And so in fact, all of these structured resources that we have at work are essentially artificial constructs based on the yesteryear way of gathering this information inside of these companies.
And I want you to continue on that thought, but I'm curious, do you think that, I don't know, it's $12 or $14 billion recent acquisition of Tableau, do you think that kind of validates that thought that maybe he understands that in some way as well? Or,
I mean, there's a reason why these guys and gals are in prominent positions, right? Hopefully they're adapting. They're keeping their ear to the ground, and they have a lot of smart people working for them as well, and they're going to continue adapting. Those are the ones that are going to survive, and then there's many others that will fall by the wayside if they don't see the signals in the market changing. I think most of them are going to get that, natural language and conforming to humans instead of forcing humans to conform to machines is going to be the final way to deliver these types of services, and they're all going to hop to as aggressively as they can to make that happen.
Interesting. So with Pryon, do you have to sell hardware, or what is the hardware interface? Because I would imagine this is much more of a software thing. But again, I don't know where the product is at this point. I haven't looked at it in quite a while. But how do you think about the? Well,
most hardware startups fail.
Yeah.
So that's a fool's errand from the get go. Any hardware startup, I mean, literally hug any entrepreneur that you ever find that made it happen in hardware, because that, whether they built a smoke alarm, or they built a camera or a Wi-Fi router or anything else, that is a tremendous effort on their part, and they get a lot of credit on that.
So are there but I guess at this point, most computing devices have some sort of microphone, so you're able to just use that as the interface then, I take it? Or
parse my words carefully. Remember what I say, natural language input.
Text. Yeah.
Well, so for me, I don't care if you talk. I don't care if you type. You gesture like Minority Report, right? It's just you as a human being, you speak with gestures, especially if you're Italian. You talk into systems, or you type in free form text, and Pryon as a platform is going to understand all of those forms of inputs on your mobile devices, on set-top boxes, on IP phones, and on desktops, laptops, tablets, and everything in between, smart speakers. Our capabilities can go everywhere.
Sure. Yeah. Call center, for instance, I'm sure you're transcribing, and then, hey, let's.
Yep. And that's what was really neat about Yap, right? Because we created that speech cloud. What I got to see is a myriad of different evolutionary paths for that form of technology, where some people were building hardware, and some people were doing stuff for consumers, and some people were doing stuff for enterprises. Some people were doing things for hospitals. Some folks were doing things for military applications. Like, a lot of people didn't see that parts of Yap were in Iraq, for instance.
Oh wow.
Where I felt that a lot of the defense contractors that were building translation engines were going to be a disservice to our servicemen and women, and to the local populations that in environments that they needed to interact with. They had things like Phraselator that you spoke in English, but you could only say certain specific things, and it would come out in very specific language on the other side. Whereas the types of technologies that we knew how to build, you can say anything that you wanted and it would come out, and they could say anything that they wanted and it would come out in English. That, I think, is a better way of interacting with the, with the population.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So what fundraising have you done so far? You mentioned the 12 to 18 months, but I also saw the recent press releases. Congratulations for that. But can you maybe talk to the audience about the most recent round of fundraising?
I always joke when any one of us that do this stuff congratulate. I tend to not congratulate people that do funding, because it's like permission to fail in a more spectacular way. It's sort of like a video game, right? Until you get to the end where it's that broken level of PacMan. That's an exit. Having an exit or an IPO is you've reached a broken level of Pac-Man. But
sure,
like, all right, now you hit the cherry, now you hit the orange, now you hit the the banana level. And so I guess we hit the banana level.
We're sorry, Mario, but our princess is in another castle, you're saying?
That's right. No, so we raised, I guess we were the largest financing of an AI company to date, and that just came out in CB Insights as of 24 hours ago.
Oh, wow.
And so we raised just about $25 million.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, that's already twice than we had last time. But it's really being thoughtful about, can we just put an accelerant on this and just get as large as possible? Right?
Okay.
I think it's, to look at the great work that founders such as Goodnight have done with SaaS,
mm-hmm.
in the Cary area, and these people are inspiration, right? They literally built a city around them as well, and I think some of us are looking that as an example to live up to.
Well, Red Hat as well. That's the biggest exit in the history of tech, and that's a Raleigh-based company as well. Very cool. So, do I have it right that Engage Ventures invested in one or more of your rounds?
That's right. So that's a strategic consortium that includes AT&T, I believe, Goldman Sachs, New York Stock Exchange, UPS, Delta Airlines, Home Depot, and several other brands. And
they're housed on the Georgia Tech campus inside the ATDC building, if I've got that.
That's correct. Right, in Atlanta, yes.
Yeah. That's interesting, because my understanding is that the enterprises fund it, but then they also, it's a really good way to drive innovation, because they can become customers to the portfolio companies. They can mentor them. And ultimately, some of them ostensibly will end up acquiring the companies that are a really good fit for them. How important is getting feedback from live enterprise customers to your overall product roadmap versus the innovation that you and the team want to drive? It seems like there's a balancing act, because you as the disruptor have to drive the process to some extent, but you've also got to temper that with the facts on the ground of what can actually be done and operationalized by the large enterprise clients who aren't disruptors, but at the end of the day, they're operating at scale. They've got requirements, bureaucracy, they've got governance, they've got all sorts of other things. Can you maybe talk about that balance and how you kind of think about that?
Yeah, that's a great and difficult question. Right?
Sure.
You go to them, and of course you try to be thoughtful. What do you need? We'll make exactly what you need, and we'll both be happy. I'll have a customer, and you'll have something that immediately changes your fortunes. And yet, that's half the challenge. The other half of the challenge is the fact that nobody asked for a Tesla, nobody asked for an iPod, nobody asked for an iPhone, nobody asked for a lot of the innovations. Nobody asked.
Nobody wanted cloud-based AI or voice processing.
Nobody asked for this stuff. So some of us just kind of say, yeah, okay, I'm trying this out. Nobody really wants it, but my spidey sense is going haywire that this is a big deal, and I'm just going to throw the Hail Mary, because I really think that once they see this and encounter this, they will it'll be like an opiate.
Yeah.
They won't be able to live life without
get on that heroin drip. Yeah.
Right. And by the way, that ended up happening with Yap. Once people, carrier executives had voicemail to text provision on their BlackBerries, after 30 days, when the trials ended and we shut off access to the trials, they did everything possible to call down to the program managers that were running the evaluation, and they're like, turn that on, no matter what you have to do, because it just became indispensable. Because back then, right, we were getting so many voicemails per day. I mean, that's, I don't know, maybe 30 minutes a day practically that you needed to process these things. Now we take it for granted that we just read it. Okay, blah, blah, blah.
Well, even something as simple as visual voicemail. I remember when that came out, I thought voicemail was fine. You call, you put in your code, you remember a couple of archaic commands, 3 to delete, 4 to replay, 5 to say, whatever they were. Right? And then you come up with, and you couldn't have come up with visual voicemail in a customer survey because nobody knew that they even needed it. Right.
Right. Well, I think where visual voicemail became big is when people started consuming MP3 music.
Yeah.
And they started seeing audio files in sequential order, and you hit the little play button and you listen to it, and it's like,
I didn't even think about that. Yeah. That is a big change that changes your behavior and your expectation.
Yeah. And that's why I give a lot of credit to consumer companies, because they end up de-risking something as an interaction method.
Mm-hmm.
So think Napster comes out, and then somebody figures out, oh, we can take that to work, and let's do this visual voicemail, and all of these audio files, instead of music, they're voicemails, and now let's also put the text in there, and now people can.
Yeah, now we add the transcription, and all of a sudden you've got wild productivity games.
It's indispensable. So those are the types of moments that we're looking for in AI. In the last time, around the time that we exited, we were also starting to get term sheets and inclinations for our B round from Sequoia, from Intel Capital, Telefonica, Comcast, and several other parties. That's when I really started encountering strategic investors, and that was by that time it was already year 4 or year 5 of our company. And so when I noticed the quality of their questions and the use cases that they were driving as well, it just was completely obvious to me that, if I ever started another company, I would try to seek out those big companies.
Yeah.
Much, not year 5, but month 5.
Yeah.
Literally in month 5, is when we sought out that group.
Well, Tiago and Engage are really onto something there. I think. I mean, I think it's a win-win for the entrepreneurs and for the corporates for sure.
So, another piece of North Carolina trivia, and I know some reporters, maybe later in the year are going to be writing a story on this. We actually tried to do
Cornerstone. Yeah.
In North and South Carolina.
So I've thought a lot about this, and can I tell you what I think was different between Atlanta and Charlotte? I can't speak to South Carolina as much, but I think in Atlanta you've got a much more diverse economy, and so you can get 12 corporates who don't compete on any given level with one another. But I think that because Charlotte, especially at the time that you and Daniel were working on that, it was, and I get it, you weren't just Charlotte. I believe Red Hat was one of the early had committed some early money. But if you're raising money in Charlotte from corporates, you're on some level, you're talking to some massive banks who maybe compete with one another. And I feel like that has to be an uphill battle that Engage did not have to go up against. It's a lot easier to get SunTrust to cooperate with Delta Airlines and UPS and Home Depot, or the other names that you mentioned, than it might be to get Bank of America and Wachovia to share notes on their innovation initiatives. But please do proceed.
Yeah, but there are places where the banks work together, right? I mean, there's
sure. Zelle, the Zelle network, for instance, the clearinghouse. Yeah.
There are places where they can work together and know, hey, this is a critical piece of technology that we need to be competitive on an international stage, and it needs to be like Stone Soup Parable. We all need to support this thing, and we benefit from it being headquartered near us, so that we can tend to its evolution. No, I think one of the things that helped Atlanta is the fact that they can be on one beltway, and with a little plate, a collection plate, and they got it done.
Yeah. Atlanta's one of those rare cities where you have a world-class university but you also have these massive just a huge city with a thriving, diverse economy. And so people don't have to leave the university to get a wonderful job in whatever industry they want to. That's very, very unique, I think, that you have that. And again, maybe that's not a core reason that it happened, but I don't think it's any accident that it's on the Georgia Tech campus that they pulled this together.
Right. Well, I mean, we did try to involve the universities here as well. I mean, so Daniel, that you mentioned, Daniel Friel used to run corporate venture capital of a Bank of America, and he saw that, the bank achieved a tremendous return on investment while at the same time investing in companies that would benefit the bank and create innovations that were necessary for it to survive and thrive. And that's where he decided to take that concept and have several different corporates lining up and working together. So B of A was approached, and Wachovia was approached.
Duke Energy was, if I'm not mistaken.
Duke Energy made an early commitment under the...
And they were under the leadership of Jim Rogers, and they weren't dealing with coal ash and the fallout of the acquisition of Progress and a bunch of other things.
But who the godfathers of this that convened sessions with several of their peer CEOs in Charlotte. It was Jim Rogers and Hugh McCall that convened a meeting.
Two visionary leaders, to say the least.
Of Duke Energy and Bank of America, and Jim Whitehurst up in Raleigh. We were actually the first ever meeting that they took in the new Red Hat headquarters building.
So we sold a Mentra to Red Hat, and it was Jim Whitehurst's first acquisition, and so I got to work fairly closely with Jim, and I will say I'm not surprised to hear that he had that kind of vision. Just a very young, very bright, very visionary type of CEO to be certain.
Right. Well, and he also got trained, I guess, at Delta Airlines too, right? So he had that Atlanta mindset. And I don't know if it was because we were geographically dispersed in order to get Cornerstone up and running. We had to be in Charleston and Columbia.
Yeah.
And Charlotte, and we tried to get Boeing involved and BMW involved, SCANA involved. I mean, we literally were trying to make it.
Was this back? Was Bobby Hitt running commerce in South Carolina?
And he was.
He's a guy who can get it done, right?
Yeah, and he was convening a lot of these capabilities as well. But guess what? We never got to the critical mass where the fund would make sense. And we wanted to run the Engage model, which was before Engage. The Engage model was do invest in companies that you're willing to become a customer of.
Yeah.
And because for people like me, that ratifies our work, and it makes the Series A process. And by the way, a Series A process is a very hard thing to pass through as a startup. I typically joke from a probabilistic standpoint, you probably have greater odds of slipping and dying in the shower than you do closing a Series A round. People to know how hard it is to typically close that level of financing for a company, because it comes with more oversights, and it's they're essentially picking some winners, right?
Yeah.
It's not winning the Olympics, but it's getting selected so that you can appear at the Olympics.
Okay. That's a great analogy. I've not heard that before. So we've talked about the significance of Engage. You've got some other, and I think this was announced in the press release, so I hope I'm not speaking out of school, but you've got some amazing investors on your cap chart now: Revolution, Briar Capital, Greycroft. Can you maybe talk about the significance of having folks? Obviously, you get some oversight, but I imagine there's some benefits of having some really, really brand name type of investors at this stage.
Well, I mean, certainly they each come with networks and capabilities and portfolio companies that we can be working with. But remember, when we talk about brands, let's scratch the surface. It's the people. It's the people behind the scenes that are ones that give you a lot of comfort that you want to work with them, right? And,
yep.
And they're always available. They're always providing certain introductions. They're providing strategic insight. Hey, I have this problem. Would you break left or right? With this particular decision, how would you think through this? How would you compensate that? How would you price that? How would you deal with this legal issue? How would you, settle the economics for that? Should we go all in on a breakthrough land grab, or should we do the slow grow and just go through, several trials and production runs, and grow it that way? So they're all very accomplished in their own right. I particularly enjoy meeting people that have been operators in the past as well. That's why, Steve Case is, such a great personality who's built, AOL and Time Warner ahead of their time, right? Because everybody kind of laughed and snickered at, why are you putting access and media together? And now what do you have? Verizon buying Yahoo, right?
Yeah. It's
buying Time Warner.
It became the blueprint, even though it was it's a case. I mean, at business school, that was a case study of M&A gone bad, right?
But it was the exactly right move.
Yeah.
And maybe what hindered it was just the lack of bandwidth to support, driving that content into the home at that point in time. And maybe that was just it.
Yeah.
That was the defect. But if the AOL service still existed on broadband today with that access to content, it would be game over and everybody would have to conform to that. So it literally, sometimes I say it's like flying a Learjet, too high or too low and you crash. You got to find that perfect glide slope where you can't be early enough where a market can't be developed, but you can't be late enough where there's already leaders that dominate that market. Yeah. It's really a popular thing to start these companies.
And on Revolution, it's great to see people in Charlotte, as you know, having spent some time here, like to talk a lot about, we need an ecosystem and we need venture funding and we need all of this. And I'm like, no, we need one mega exit. And a mega exit, to me, I always point to the AOL example, right? It's an exit that creates a handful of billionaires. It creates thousands of millionaires, and it creates just this wealth of talent. And I think what you're seeing now in DC, because they've had a couple of mega exits, right? When you look, whether you're looking at Cap One and Nigel Morris and what they did, and now you've got QED that's out there investing in all sorts of fintech companies and just creating all sorts of wealth and knock-on effects. But Revolution's probably an even bigger example where you take AOL and that leads to Revolution, and now Revolution is funding all sorts of world beating companies. To me, that's the missing ingredient that most cities, I'm sure you've read about the $1 trillion startup Fairchild Semiconductor, which most of modern Silicon Valley can trace its roots back to Fairchild Semiconductor. And so I'm hoping, SaaS is one great building block. Red Hat's another great building block. Hopefully Pryon's another great building block for that story within Raleigh and within North Carolina as well.
Well, I mean, but all the stars have to align, right? Yeah. So, AOL, maybe single-handedly built, the technical ecosystem around, around DC as well. I mean, certainly there's a lot of defense contractors, but as far as on the commercial side, there's a lot of veterans that came out of
Ted Leonsis, and you think of everything that he's done, both in terms of his leadership and turning Groupon around, because Revolution was an investor there. But then you think about what it's done for the community. It really is a true multiplier effect.
Yeah, and I have to tell you, the one thing that you highlighted is with all of these stakeholders, they all have different strengths. They all have different networks. There's different attributes that they can bring. Their DNA becomes a part of our company. It's like sitting down with Dan Ariely, and in some of his writings, it's the people that figured out how to share risk and share reward are the ones that end up winning.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not over tilted in our company's favor. It's not over tilted in our investors' favor. It's not over tilted in our customers' favor, and it's not over tilted in our partners' favor. Finding that equilibrium around
or win-win. Yeah.
Yeah, win-win amongst all of these different stakeholders is the thing that just keeps this thing, going like a runaway freight train. They all have, different strengths, and it's like a strand of DNA, right? It's not just one piece or two chromosomes that you need. It's a myriad of them that define who you are as a person. This is why I don't call companies by my last name. like some people are fascinated by doing, because it has to be something that you're willing to share with others.
Sure. Well, no, it's funny. When we started Levvel, we called it Ladder Partners, which is not either Chris or my name, but it was something very local to Charlotte. Edward Edward Dilworth Latta, and you see Latta everywhere. And when we first started the company, it wasn't going to become, in our mind, it wasn't meant to be what it became. But as soon as we saw the shift and that we were on to something, and that, that we could attract really good employees, and that was attracting great customers, and it just created this virtuous cycle, we decided that we needed to come up with a brand that was more generic, but that more global in nature. And I think that is really, really important is to think about what is it that this company wants to become. It needs, if you want it to just be this small local thing that's just about one person, name it after yourself or name it after a neighborhood in your home city.
Listen, I'm even embarrassed at the brand name of Yap last time, right? It's what do we name the company after? And then a dog barks, and we're like, all right, let's call it Yap. There's a trademark for that. Let's get running on that. And then years later, we're doing very serious things for very serious people, and we're in all these carriers and stuff like that. And I'm like, I can't believe I have Yap researched. But look, Google and Yahoo and all of these company names, I mean, they're just silly in hindsight.
One of my favorite examples is a small group of really, really talented people that we partnered with in a prior life. And I think they're still at it, but they were a group of consultants, and again, very smart, very dedicated people. And the name of their company was 5 a.m. Solutions. And so we all assumed that meant that they were working until 5 a.m. together. But it turned out that there was a South Park episode where there was a creature that was a 5-assed monkey. And so that was the inspiration, was the 5-assed monkey solutions. So people will project whatever they want onto a name, because I wouldn't have thought that Yap was related to a dog. I thought it would have something to do with talking, because you run your Yap,
Yeah, but that's what we thought. All right, we needed something that we couldn't use the word talk or voice or this or that. It was so cliche for space, and it was just different enough. Inside of our logo in Pryon, we hide lots of little puzzles, right? Those dots mean something. The selection of colors means something, and obviously using the code name means something as well. I think when you attract, very intellectual people into companies, you have to do a lot more than hand somebody a job, right? You have to hand them a mission, and we have a mission, right? To not only support, commercial sector, but also public sector, to support academic environments, to support nonprofits. I think that's the expectations people have of modern companies, is that we're not sociopathic, where we're trying to squeeze every last morsel out of the environment. It's, I'm going to do a little bit extra, because I know when you run your company, you're going to do a little bit of extra, and then somebody else is going to do a little bit extra, and that little bit extra are the things that move these communities forward.
Absolutely. So in your mind, what industries are best poised to take advantage of modern enterprise AI technology, the type that you're developing at Pryon?
Well, some people focus on vertical solutions, right? Hey, I'm going to do some things just in banking. Hey, I'm going to do some things just in healthcare. I'm going to do some things just in retail. What you end up doing then is you attract one or two very brilliant people that are highly passionate about that vertical and that industry. And then the rest are kind of there, for a job, and they don't really care.
Yeah.
I actually like horizontal solutions. I like things that are, as they call it, multi-industry, right? Where you can build something that's relevant to literally everybody. Because instead of just getting 2 brilliant people, I can get 20. I can get 40. I can get 100. Because they're all going to, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Yeah. One is going to say, hey, I really care about taking this platform to healthcare. Hey, I really care about taking this platform to, to higher ed. Hey, I really care about taking this to senior citizen homes. Hey, I really care about, taking it somewhere else. So I prefer building horizontal platforms. The things that we were selling to service providers last time, so wireless carriers and the like, you can do whatever you want. You want to search? Fine. You want to shop? Fine. You want to check weather? Fine. You want to check sports scores? Fine. Whatever you want, it'll do. These smart speakers that people now have in their homes, right? Whether they're HomePods, Google Homes, Amazon devices, you can ask it whatever you want.
Sure. So I guess your answer is it doesn't really matter, or who are you to pick the industry that's going to really figure out the best use of the application, right?
Well, think about, the friends and family members that you enjoy spending the most time, or the peers that you end up spending the most time, or the, partners or clients and stuff like that. It's not the ones that are one-trick ponies where you can only discuss a very finite domain of knowledge with them, but they really have no capabilities beyond that. I mean, we like Renaissance people that can off-road and run through, lots of thoughts.
Well, from my perspective, so I'm a career consultant, obviously. In a couple of lives, I've done consulting, and it's because I tend to prefer to be a generalist. But we did find at Levvel that we didn't organize the entire company around verticals or around industries, but we did we organized a lot of the sales team around vertical practices, and we treated it as the tip of the spear. So we can come in and do some strategy consulting, speak your language, figure out the specific solutions that you're trying to solve, but then it's just the tip of the spear or the tip of the iceberg. And then you back the truck up with these broad consulting capabilities that really, at the end of the day, you're developing Java code or Ruby code or Node or React. And it didn't really matter the industry, but we found that as a kind of tip of the spear, that was a really good balancing act between the two.
Well, like I said, you can find one or two people are highly passionate about that, and there's your tip of the spear, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But everybody else is developing a platform capability under that, and it's stone soup powerful at that point in time.
Yeah, absolutely. So which of the big vendors is most impressive to you in this space? I mean, I know you've talked about Amazon and Google. So I take it that really those are. But are there any others besides those that are big vendors that are really making moves in this space?
Azure is doing a great job. Obviously, Oracle is agitating for the federal government business with the DoD, platform, the JEDI platform. They have their own strengths and weaknesses.
Sure.
Every single one of them. They're all being run by extremely bright people. Mm-hmm. And even saying that, it doesn't matter to me what they do.
Right? Well, and let's talk about that. Do you view them as competitors or partners, or is it both, or
none of the above? Right. Yeah. Only 1 out of 10,000 startups, and I remember this. If I'm remembering the statistic well, one of the first investor ever in our company is an applied AI fund in San Francisco called Bootstrap Labs. Yep. And one of the statistics that they shared is only 1 out of 10,000 startups fails because of a competitive threat that sunk them. Mm-hmm. 9,999 fail because of execution failures.
Yeah. Okay. I had not heard that statistic, but I've shared that sentiment. So guess what? Cares what your competitors doing?
Yeah. So Google and Amazon and Microsoft and Oracle and Cisco and the rest of them, it's not them. Mm-hmm. They're tending to the things that they need to tend to, which is they have their own ecosystem of customers and partners and developers and things of that sort. They're going to keep reinforcing their strategies. They're all led by capable people, and they're obviously successful companies. But I'm moving our company into a $1.7 trillion market opportunity. Even after those big entities take their pound of flesh, there's going to be plenty.
Yeah.
To allow companies like mine to survive and thrive. And as long as I know that, guess what our team has to do? One foot in front of the other, day after day, and then we'll rise to the prominence that we deserve based on based on our work ethic.
Great. No, that's very well said. So I want to be cognizant of your time because it is a Friday evening here, but so I'm going to shift gears to startups and ecosystems, and I've just got a handful of questions here.
Better than to say that. I mean, there's no such thing as nights and weekends and startup.
That is true. So we mentioned that you raise money from Revolution, but in particular, I believe they've got a fund called the Rise of the Rest Fund. Can you maybe speak to what is meant by this term, the Rise of the Rest?
Yeah, what a great community service they're doing with that fund and with the initiative in general, and all this supporting the capabilities that they have. working with everybody on that staff has been such a joy. And just seeing the diversity of founders that they're backing and teams and markets that are being addressed. The fact that they realize that, cancer, doesn't necessarily have to be cured in San Francisco and Boston, right? That, faster than light travel is maybe going to be, done in Peoria, right? The fact that our nation needs economic diversity, the fact that you have brilliant people, distributed evenly throughout our land, right, and fully engaging them.
Well, and there's great cities like Nashville and Des Moines and Boise. It isn't only San Francisco, Chicago, LA.
Random guy and gal watching Stanford MOOCs and reading stories on TechCrunch and reading these types of things, and they're getting started as one person, and then they get a cluster as 2 people, 4 people, 8 people, so on and so forth. And these things end up, coming out of left field, which is why, tongue in cheek, I sometimes enjoy, telling people, hey, that thing, might have not existed if it wasn't for things that were happening in Charlotte, North Carolina, and you probably assumed it came out of Boston or Seattle. Mm-hmm. And yet a lot of the themes that ended up becoming critical elements of that ended up happening in other places. But think of what Steve and JD and the rest of them have been able to do, right? Not only did they say, hey, this is a good idea, and let's go ahead and make these communities aware that they're important, and we're trying to find a way to support them. You also had, very senior people that are already accomplished in their fields, right? Mm-hmm. Right. You had Bezos and Schmidt and John Durr and Dalio and all of these folks. The Cook brothers, the Walton family contribute into it, and so the level of connectivity that you can get from that is just astounding. They're putting their money with their mouths. I have to say, they're doing more than some politicians that I cross paths with. Certainly every 2 or 4 years, they all love getting on soapboxes talking about how much they love job creators. And yet, they go ahead and nix things like angel tax credits. Yeah. Right. And then you scratch your head and you're like, well, wait a minute, almost 80% of my angel investors last time used that to de-risk their investment. And my company might have not existed. And my singular exit practically paid for the credit for so many other founders. And I don't, have arrogance and ego to think that I was the only exit that this state ever had. Mm-hmm. Why did you guys nix that? You never talked to me about it. Right. Yeah. And I have to say, one of the, contrary things, and I'm sure some of you have seen the CNN ad about the Startup New York program. And I was trying to figure out if it was real or not. And by golly, it is. For a decade, work at a tax-free site in partnership with, an academic institution, and there is 0% tax.
I had a friend of mine on the podcast who he's actually is building hardware. Acer's building the hardware for him, but he's packaging hardware with software, and he's offering essentially a Jitterbug tablet. Remember the Jitterbug phone, and he's having wild success. He's on HGTV. His commercials are on HGTV, on CNN, on CNBC. He's in Target and Best Buy, and he recently partnered with a large home healthcare provider out of Europe, and he needed a European headquarters, and so he was courted by the I think it's the IDF. It's an Irish development fund, and they get it. I mean, they had to reinvent their economy, and so they created some real tax structures to really attract just this type of company. And it isn't just the Apples and the Microsofts and all the large companies that we read about, but it's this next tier of companies that are in the $10 to $100 million revenue range. They're really rolling out the red carpet, and I think he said that the first 20 employees that he hires, they pay the first third of their annual salary, or so, it's just something like that. But when you think about what that investment means, and you multiply that by the hundreds and thousands of companies that are coming to depressed areas in Ireland, it really is a multiplier effect. But to your point, as good as those are, I don't even think that's as impactful as what they're doing with Revolution's Rise of the Rest and some of these other efforts that we're reading about, because really putting the money in and investing and the mentorship and the networking, the network connections that they're able to make. I mean, that's really how you drive job creation.
Well, I mean, I hate to, yeah, it's interesting. I call shenanigans on them. Like I say, they go on soapboxes. They say they love job fairs, and then when you say, "Fine, point me to policy that you guys were able to get through that benefit my ability to grow the company and increase your tax base and innovate here and have large outcomes at a certain point in time," and I just don't see it.
Yeah.
I mean,
or you go sign a bill like HB2, right?
Well, I mean, that's opening up another can of worms. Again, wedge issues every 4 years. I mean, that's the equivalent of an own goal.
Yeah.
Right.
I agree.
And so we never get the critical mass of big migrations of Google satellite headquarters,
PayPal,
PayPal's and Apple's and things like that, which do what? The gold standard of entrepreneurs obviously are serial entrepreneurs, people that have prior exits and IPOs. The second, the silver standard are intrapreneurs, right? People that work with these big companies, right? And it doesn't matter if it's Duke Energy, Bank of America, Google or whatnot. They end up seeing some opening in the market. They're highly trained, they're well connected, they can yank their teams out of these experiences, and they go ahead and start these companies. And so in order to increase your probability of these types of outcomes, well, you need to have as many of these things, creating entrepreneurs as possible, and create the conditions for them to thrive, meaning lots of water, lots of energy, lots of everything.
Yeah.
Right? I'm speaking as if it's a rainforest. and somehow here, the way that I describe a Southeast startup anywhere, and it doesn't matter if it's here, if it's in Atlanta, if it's
Nashville,
anywhere,
Tampa. Yep.
We are the creatures that figured out how to survive in a desert. We've adapted to survive and thrive in the desert. We know how to eat a little drop of water, and we know to only move in the middle of the night.
Well, that's interesting, and you're transitioning to exactly where I wanted to go. So you started Yap, I think, in Charlotte, Pryon in Raleigh. What advantages do these cities have over more established entrepreneurial hubs and cities? And I think the point, we talked earlier about the value of adversity, and I think you're hitting on that. But are there other values besides the adversity of having and again, I point to the rise of the Japanese auto manufacturers. Their infrastructure was demolished. They didn't have the natural resources that the Germans and the Italians and the Americans, the countries that typically dominated auto manufacturing. And so they had to invent Kanban. They had to invent just in time. They had to invent manufacturing techniques that now even the larger, more well-endowed country manufacturers are adopting. But what are some of the other advantages besides that kind of adversity that you're speaking to there that you've maybe seen in a Charlotte or a Raleigh?
I hate to say this, but some of us are enjoy comfortable discomfort. We almost like the challenge of starting the race from the back of the pack.
Yeah, I've heard it called the productive discomfort zone, and if anybody who's worked with me closely will tell you that I try to live in that zone.
A massive outcome is more delicious when you're starting at a disadvantage, honestly, because what advantage do I gain from this market? A lot of the politicians say, well, you can hire staff at a more efficient rate. We have all these schools minting talent, so on and so forth. And I'm like, why do you want me to pay these people less? Right? Yeah. My mind costs the same whether I live here, whether I live in Manhattan, whether I live in San Francisco, whether I live.
And I can work remotely for Zoom, and they'll pay me 30% more than here. Right?
I never got that line of reasoning. Honestly, it's and they're driving around Mercedes and BMW and all sorts of fancy cars. And that car costs exactly the same, whether you buy, here in Philadelphia and Boston or Los Angeles. Right. And so why why does a human cost differently than a car? Right? You want this human to go from point A to point B. You want a car to go from point B. You go to Mercedes. They're like, hey, this car is $50,000. In LA, it's $50,000 in Philadelphia. You go to a human being in San Francisco, that human's going to cost $90,000. In North Carolina, it's going to cost you $50,000. No, I'd rather pay them, the market rates, irrespective of that. So now fundraising. Right, you alluded to it several times during our conversation. Where are we going to get financing in the Southeast? For the most part, you have to get on an airplane and go to New York. You have to get on an airplane, go to Boston, go to DC, go to Seattle, go to
or Austin, maybe. Yeah.
Austin, to a lesser extent, but certainly you go to the Bay Area. And so, what do those folks, start telling you? Why aren't you here?
Mm-hmm.
Why are you growing the company there? And you have to give them a solid reason. Well, I have access to, certain marquee talent that I can draw out of, some of the brands that are local here, but I'm still going to have satellites in these different key cities because, it's undeniable that there's, AI talent in those markets that I need to unlock, for us to be successful.
Well, what advice do you have for people starting a company in a second tier? And I don't mean that in the pejorative. These are clearly second tier cities for starting startups, and maybe third and fourth tier and some. But what advice do you have for those entrepreneurs when it comes to raising money, hiring a team, finding advisors, given that it is an uphill battle? It sounds like it's be scrappy and be ready to, be ready to have these conversations.
Well, and get comfortable living on an airplane.
Okay.
I mean, because otherwise, I think even if you do find local investors, you still need to understand what the market rate is for your work.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have to get on an airplane and collect, several term sheets. Understand, how the business
interesting,
is valued, and then come back and say, yes, that's a fair rate. That's somebody that's done their homework. Anybody that's not willing to do that, the sweat equity or, grinding it out, I'm going to say that investors, unless they counter, investors probably shouldn't even fund that person because it's negative self-selection. You're now, promoting somebody who's lazy.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great point.
You got to turn over every stone. I remember with one, investor, he's like, wow, it's a pain in the neck, to negotiate with you. And I'm like, what type of personality do you think, is going to work hard to get you the best talent? What type of personality do you think is going to, work tirelessly to get your customers? What personality does it take to get scaling partners? And what personality does it have to sit toe to toe and negotiate, an outcome, whether it's an exit or an IPO?
Well, that's a great point. I would have you could ask that investor, do you think Travis Kalanick or Mark Zuckerberg were easy to negotiate with, right? But they created a fabulous wealth for their investors.
But here's the thing, like I said before, you're not trying to over optimize your position. As long as people listen, you're trying to find the point of equilibrium amongst a diverse set of stakeholders. You want everybody to win. I can't win without them. I literally can't. And they can't win without me. They have to place bets, right? Their partners are expecting them to make investments. And I need their capital in order to accelerate our evolution as well. There is a win-win if you find the right partners and you're honest about, how you're going to be measured and what outcomes people are seeing. In the Southeast, there's a fascination with quick wins and singles and doubles, right? And the one thing that I can appreciate from everybody that's involved in this company, both in terms of our staff and in terms of our financiers, from small to large, everybody looked at us and said, "We want the big outcome. We're good. Here's our networks. Here's the support. Here's our experts. Here's our advisors. Here's our mentors. Everything's open to you in order to get that large outcome and." Dress for the job you want, not for the job you have. Start signaling to the world that you expect to be one of the top 10 most prominent AI companies in creation. And that's what we're doing. And I know it seems silly to say that in year 2, right?
No, it's why I could tell right away. I wanted to back you. Not that you needed me, but I wanted to be part of that for sure.
No, but those of us that are honest, you think Google and Facebook and eBay and Amazon and all of these companies didn't look like hot messes in year 2?
Yep.
And something special happened. As I look to
well, Facebook looked like a hot mess even a year after their IPO, right?
Yeah, these things are always works in progress. Yep. Forever. They're always adapting to market conditions, to new technologies. You're always adding team members. Every new person that you add, you're stronger and better for it, right? They're not here to come in and conform to your culture. They're here to enhance your capabilities, not conform to them, right? And so we grow based on the quality of individuals that we both attract and retain as well. So that's what makes it exciting, right? Is the fact that it's
definitely
a construct and what's very quirky in some ways, that when people meet the other members of my C-suite, they see that each one represents a different piece of my personality.
Okay.
Right? So one's more introverted, but intellect far greater than mine. Another person very methodological and OCD. Another one is Boy Scout by the book. Another one is like a wheeler dealer type. Another person is highly creative, and it's such a blessing to work with them because you feel like you can express all of your strengths, marshaled and concentrated through those individuals that lead different pieces of that. And again, I just don't want to talk about them. Every single person in your team is that way. They're just a different representation and a better version of yourself in that capability. That's what I want. I want 5 years into this company. I want to submit my resume to it and somebody to throw it in the shredder and say, you're no longer good enough to work here.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And it's the same thing with, my dad went to UVA in the 70s, and we always laugh because even by the 90s, he would not have been able to get in. And I'm like, well, that's wonderful. That's what you want in anything, right? But especially in a company that you build, you want a company that wouldn't hire you.
Yeah, you're doing. I think one of the thought experiments, whenever executives leave a company and the function that they led falls apart, they always point to it and say, haha, see, I was so important. It failed without me.
Yeah.
And that's the wrong way to look at it. If you were doing your job right as a leader, you essentially create governance models and you mentor new people and you create backups and processes so that if you get hit by a bus, it still survives and thrives without you, because all of the remaining stakeholders, including your family members, are important to support.
Yep.
Right? So it's like counterintuitive. It's like, of course I want to be useless. That's the number one thing. That means, things are working for customers and I'm going to be like the Maytag repairman for AI.
Yeah.
If it works and everybody's happy, I'm just going to be sitting there bored out of my mind looking around because nobody's going to be calling me.
Yeah.
That's the ideal scenario. That's how you know it works. That's how you know it's a single mouse button. The iPod works. The iPhone works. That's that's nirvana.
Absolutely. So I don't know how plugged in to the Charlotte scene you've been since leaving the city. Are you plugged in enough to comment on what's maybe changed over the past decade? And if not, maybe we could just talk about North Carolina more broadly, or even the Southeast, if that's more appropriate.
Charlotte's thriving. I mean, I think public transportation is a big deal because now you can get to different nooks and crannies in the community as well. So it's
and we need it because our traffic is a disaster, by the way.
Well, that's, whenever people complain about that, I'm like, well,
that's a good thing.
The pitfalls of low unemployment and success is unfortunately, a dark attribute of traffic. Certainly with, the recent announcement with the Lowe's Technology Center, right? These types of things, the banks obviously keep bolstering their capabilities.
Well, and Truist, and we now have 3 top 6 banks headquartered here, which is amazing, because for a while we were thinking we might drop to 1. And not that Wells Fargo is headquartered here, but for all intents and purposes, it's a bank headquarters. They employ more people than Bank of America, even in Charlotte.
Yeah, so I mean, so that part's great. I don't know. It almost seems, and I don't know. Having lived in Charlotte and lived in Raleigh as well, it's just to be so close and yet so far on mine side is very peculiar, right?
It is.
The combined strengths are so fantastic. Maybe we need a hyperloop between the two things. Even though I take the Amtrak between the two cities, and it's entirely pleasant.
Yeah.
I don't know why it's like a hidden gem.
Well, the really interesting thing to me, so in a prior life during the Next Grid days, I got very involved with the local economic development community, and I joined the founding board of an organization called E4 Carolinas, and we talked about Jim Rogers at Duke and what a visionary he was. He convened all of the energy company leaders, because we've got a lot of, I mean, after banking, I think energy is probably the second, would arguably be the second biggest industry within Charlotte, because of Duke and Siemens and Shaw and a handful of other big players. And one of the things we did was we hired McKinsey to come in and do a study, because Jim Rogers said, I want to create the energy hub of America here. And so we hired McKinsey, and they said, you can't be the energy hub Houston is, but you can be, and you're never going to rival Houston in terms of just the oil and gas industry, but distribution and transmission and generation and nuclear are things. But Charlotte isn't big enough, because what you see in hub cities and they showed us studies of hubs, and Silicon Valley is an obvious example with tech. Boston is an example in life sciences, and they showed us Detroit as a very obvious example for automotive a few generations ago. And they said what some of the common themes that you see are world-class universities, world-class industry-leading companies, certain population densities, and there were all these things. And if you just drew a circle around Charlotte, you didn't have that. But what was interesting is if you drew a corridor extending from Columbia to Raleigh, but even if you could even extend that all the way in to include University of Virginia and Virginia Tech and Virginia, but if you just drew it from Columbia to Raleigh with Charlotte in the middle, you have every single ingredient. And so their recommendation was view this as an energy corridor, and Charlotte is kind of part of that energy, it's not, I got it wrong. Initially Jim Rogers' vision was we should be the energy capital. And they said, no, Charlotte's the center of the energy hub. And this doesn't just apply to energy, right? I think this applies in a lot of other things. Charlotte can't compete head to head with an Atlanta or a DC. But if you include Raleigh and you include Columbia and you include everything inside of that corridor, then it looks very differently. And that's why it's so frustrating to me seeing the constant battle between, and if you don't live in North Carolina, you don't really feel this, but we talked about HB2, and that really came down to a pissing contest between Raleigh and Charlotte at the end of the day. And you set an own goal. I've called it a self-inflicted wound, whatever you want to call it. We didn't need it, but there's lots of other examples of things that happen because of this. Whereas if the two could just compete and they're so close to one another, it's amazing what we're capable of when you combine the world-class research universities that you have in Raleigh with some of the world-class businesses and growing infrastructure and a lot of the other advantages that Charlotte has. It is just frustrating. I think right now, if you drive through rural towns, obviously we see dilapidated main streets and things of that sort. I think it's going to get better for them over time. Here's why. I believe between things like Hyperloop are going to make things that are hours into minutes, right? So somebody can work in downtown Charlotte or downtown Raleigh, downtown wherever, and commute to Boone or
10-minute ride later, you're at home and you're in this idyllic environment and you're getting paid these urban wages, and you're able to support your communities 10 minutes away that are typically an hour away, or through the ride share aviation, right? So all these newfangled concepts, rotorcraft and otherwise, that are being explored by Uber and others that say, hey, those are 10, 15 years away. But you're going to see a lot of people move into those places and bolster their economies, and it's going to get better for them.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to see that. I think that concentrated reward that went to urban centers is going to diffuse itself, but we had to create new modes of transportation in order to bring them into the fold.
Yep, absolutely. Well, Igor, this has been great. Thanks for everything you've done for the community, and especially thanks for creating game-changing companies. I know it's really hard work. You're well on your way to doing it twice now, so thank you for that, and especially. Huh?
It's just a hobby.
It's a hobby. Well, whatever you want to call it, thank you for that, because it is very important for all of the reasons that we've talked about here. And thanks especially for taking the time out. I know how busy you are, so I really do appreciate it.
No worries. Thanks for having me. I mean, it's your questions were spot on, and obviously expose both your experiences and the fact that they're born of somebody that has lived through these same trenches as well. Building your own capabilities up, and your viewers or listeners can find me on Twitter at my first initial last name, and I'm happy to
Thank you. We'll share all of that. We'll share all of that in the show notes. So we attach some show notes that'll have a kind of summary of poignant things that were said and at what point, and then we'll also share anything that we talked about that we can link to, like Revolution, Rise of the Rest, that sort of thing, any press releases, and then we'll also make sure to pick up your personal as well as the Pryon social media outlets that are out there. Is there anything else that we should think about sharing out there, or anything else that we haven't talked about before we end this? No,
let's put some pressure on the public sector to get off the soapbox and actually put together some honest to goodness policies, and not just show up every 2 or 4 years when they need
need the votes.
They need the votes, or they need to finance their campaigns. It's like, the people that have been there, with us day after day, week after week, month after month, certainly have a lot more credibility than the people that just pop up like Jack in the Boxes every 4 years. So
I couldn't agree more. Well, look, I had a lot more that I wanted to cover. We're going to save that for after maybe the Series B or the exit, or what is the next milestone. We would definitely love to have you back and talk a little bit further about this. So again, thank you.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Cheers. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.